Marcus Rodriguez stared at the assignment tablet like it had just insulted his mother, which, considering the Galactic Research Council's sense of humor, it might as well have. "Let me get this straight," he said to the holographic projection of Director Voss, whose perpetual smile made Mac want to throw something heavy. "You want me to study the Vorthak, the same Vorthak who turned the last 3 research teams into what I can only describe as abstract art." "Now, Mac, that's a slight exaggeration," Voss replied, his smile never wavering. "Only 2 teams were completely eliminated. The 3rd team member did survive. Yeah, as a torso with abandonment issues. Dr. Rodriguez, your expertise in xenobiology makes you uniquely qualified for this assignment. The Vorthak are apex predators, yes, but they're also highly intelligent. We need someone who can establish meaningful contact." Mac rubbed his temples. At 42, he'd studied everything from gas-breathing blob creatures to sentient crystals that sang opera badly. But the Vorthak? They were in a league of their own. 8-foot-tall, 4-armed killing machines with a social structure that made ancient Sparta look like a daycare center. And they'd never, not once in recorded history, allowed outsiders anywhere near their cubs. "Sir, with all due respect, which is very little at this point, why exactly do we need to study them? They seem perfectly happy being left alone to practice their hobby of creative dismemberment." "Because," Voss leaned forward conspiratorially, "intelligence suggests they possess advanced biotechnology, medical applications that could revolutionize healing across the galaxy. But they guard their secrets as fiercely as they guard their young." Mac sighed. Of course it came down to money. It always did. "Fine, but I want hazard pay, and a really good insurance policy, and maybe a therapist on standby." "Done. Your transport leaves in 6 hours. Oh, and Mac, try not to die immediately. It looks bad on the quarterly reports." The hologram flickered off, leaving Mac alone with his impending doom, and a coffee that had gone cold sometime during his career suicide. 4 hours later, he was strapped into a cramped transport ship with his gear and his newest companion, an AI assistant unit called PIP 7739, though it insisted on being called Pip. "Dr. Rodriguez?" Pip's cheerful voice chirped from the small sphere floating beside his seat. "I've loaded all available data on Vorthak culture, biology, and recorded interactions. Would you like me to brief you on survival statistics?" "Do I want to know?" "Well, the good news is that 17% of researchers survive initial contact. And the bad news? That's also the bad news. 17% is surprisingly high for first meetings with apex predator species. Usually it's closer to 3%. Max stared out the viewport at the approaching jungle moon. "Pip, I think this is the beginning of a very short friendship." "Optimism, Dr. Rodriguez. Perhaps we'll beat the odds." "Yeah," Mac muttered, watching the green canopy spread out below them like a verdant carpet of death. "Or perhaps we'll become a really interesting footnote in someone else's research paper." 3 days later, Mac was seriously considering the footnote option. The research station was a prefabricated dome sitting in a clearing like a metallic pimple on the face of an otherwise pristine jungle. Previous occupants had left behind some interesting additions to the standard furniture, namely scratch marks that went clean through reinforced steel plating and what appeared to be bite marks in the doorframe. "Pip, please tell me those aren't tooth marks." "I'm afraid they are, Dr. Rodriguez. Analysis suggests they belong to a fully mature Vorthak male. The depth indicates jaw pressure of approximately 4,000 pounds per square inch." "Wonderful. So they can bite through my head like a grape." Mac had spent the morning setting up his equipment and trying not to think about how quickly things could go sideways. The plan, such as it was, involved waiting for a Vorthak patrol to pass by and attempting peaceful contact. In hindsight, Mac realized the word peaceful might have been overly optimistic. The first sign of trouble was when the jungle went completely silent, not quiet, not hushed, but silent in that special way that meant something with very large teeth was approaching. The second sign was when the trees started moving without any wind. Then Keth stepped into the clearing. If someone had asked Mac to design the perfect killing machine, he probably would have come up with something like Keth. 8 feet of corded muscle, 4 arms ending in claws that could probably open cans without trying, and a face that suggested evolution had focused exclusively on intimidating as hell during development. His skin was a mottled dark green that would have been perfect camouflage if he hadn't been standing in direct sunlight, radiating menace like a space heater radiates warmth. "Greetings," Max said, stepping forward with his hands raised in what he hoped was a universal sign of peaceful intent. I am Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, representing the Galactic Research Council. I come seeking dialogue between our species. Keth's response was a series of growls, clicks, and what sounded like someone gargling gravel. Mac's universal translator crackled to life. He said, "Wait, that can't be right," Pip whispered. "According to my translation matrix, he just called you a moist pink thing that smells like fear and bad decisions." "That's probably accurate," Mac muttered. "What else?" More growling. The translator sparked ominously. "He's asking if you're here to steal cubs for your soft flesh breeding experiments, and whether you'd prefer to die quickly or slowly." Mac felt his diplomatic training kick in, which is to say he panicked and said the first thing that came to mind. "I assure you, I have no interest in your cubs. I'm actually more of a plant person, very interested in your local flora, particularly your, hunting techniques. Your agricultural techniques." The translator managed to turn this into something that made Keth's eyes narrow dangerously. More growling ensued. "Dr. Rodriguez," Pip said quietly, "I believe you just told him that you think Vortak hunters are weak and that you could teach them better ways to stalk prey." I said, "What now?" That's when Zeri arrived. If Keth was intimidating, Zara was absolutely terrifying. Slightly smaller but somehow more dangerous, she moved through the trees like liquid death with excellent reflexes. The scars across her arms and torso told stories that Mac really didn't want to hear the endings to. She dropped from a branch 20 feet up and landed without making a sound, which Mac was pretty sure violated several laws of physics. Her arrival prompted a rapid exchange between the two Vorthak that needed no translation to understand. It was the kind of conversation married couples have when one of them has brought home something potentially dangerous and definitely stupid. "Dr. Rodriguez," Pip whispered urgently, "I'm detecting elevated stress pheromones from both subjects. I believe we may have entered what humans call a oh crap situation." Zara stalked forward until she was close enough that Mac could see his own reflection in her pupils. She said something that made the translator emit a small puff of smoke and die completely. "Pip, please tell me you got that." She said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that you look like something she'd scrape off her claws after a successful hunt. Mac took a step backward and immediately tripped over his own equipment case. He landed hard on his back, staring up at two apex predators who were now looking at him like he was dinner, and entertainment rolled into one convenient package. "You know what?" he said to the sky. "Maybe the footnote thing is looking pretty good right about now." Mac was contemplating whether his death would be quick enough to avoid embarrassment when he heard it. A soft, whimpering sound coming from somewhere behind the two towering predators. It was weak, pitiful, and absolutely heartbreaking. Keth and Zara immediately turned toward the sound, their aggressive postures shifting to something Mac recognized despite the species barrier: parental concern. They exchanged a rapid series of clicks and growls before Zara bounded back into the jungle with fluid grace. "Pip," Mac whispered, still flat on his back, "please tell me you recorded that sound." "I did, Dr. Rodriguez. Analysis suggests it came from a juvenile Vorthak in distress, possibly ill." Mac slowly sat up, noting that Keth's attention was now divided between threatening him and glancing anxiously in the direction Zara had gone. The massive predator's body language screamed protective parent, which gave Mac an idea that was either brilliant or spectacularly stupid. "Your cub is sick," Mac said, pointing toward the jungle and then pantomiming illness by clutching his stomach and making what he hoped were universal signs of distress. Keth's four eyes fixed on him with laser intensity. More growling. "He's asking how you know this," Pip translated, apparently having rebooted successfully. "Also, he's questioning your parentage and suggesting your mother had intimate relations with a particularly unattractive space slug." "Tell him I'm a healer," Mac said, slowly getting to his feet and pulling out his medical scanner. "I study living things to help them when they're hurt." The translation apparently worked because Keth's posture shifted slightly from "kill immediately" to "kill if necessary." Progress. Zara returned, carrying something that made Mac's heart clench despite every survival instinct screaming at him to run. It was a Vorthak cub, barely the size of a house cat, with oversized eyes and fur that should have been glossy black but was instead dull and patchy. The little thing wheezed with each breath, and even Mac could see it was seriously ill. "Oh," Mac said softly, his scientific curiosity overriding his sense of self-preservation. "Oh, you poor little guy." He took a step forward, hands outstretched, and found himself staring down the business end of 8 very sharp claws as both parents moved to block his path. "I want to help," Max said, his voice carrying a sincerity that needed no translation. "I'm a doctor. I've treated dozens of species. Please, let me look at him." What followed was the longest 30 seconds of Mac's life as the two Vorthak had what appeared to be a heated discussion about whether to let the weird pink alien near their sick child or just eat him and be done with it. Mac could practically see the mental scales tipping back and forth. Finally, Keth stepped aside with obvious reluctance. Zara, however, positioned herself where she could remove Mac's head from his shoulders if he made one wrong move. "Okay, little one," Mac said, approaching the cub with the same gentle tone he'd use with any frightened patient. "Let's see what's wrong with you." The cub, who Mac immediately nicknamed Runt due to his small size, looked up at him with eyes that were far too knowing for something so young. Mac activated his medical scanner and began a careful examination, while both parents watched his every move. "Pip, what am I looking at here?" "Preliminary scans suggest a respiratory infection, possibly viral. There are also signs of malnutrition and what appears to be a compromised immune system." Mac frowned. "That doesn't make sense. Apex predators usually have robust immune systems." He looked up at the anxious parents. "How many cubs are sick?" The answer came in the form of more distressed whimpering from deeper in the jungle. Lots more whimpering. "Oh no," Mac said, the full scope of the situation hitting him. "This isn't just one sick cub, this is an epidemic." Keth and Zara exchanged a look that transcended species barriers. It was the look of parents watching their children suffer and being powerless to stop it. Mac made a decision that his insurance company would probably object to. "I can help," he said, looking directly at Keth. "But I'll need to examine all the cubs, and I'll need access to your territory. This is bigger than one sick baby." For the first time since arriving on the jungle moon, Mac saw something other than hostility in a Vorthak's eyes. He saw hope, and possibly his own death sentence, but at this point, that seemed like a secondary concern. 3 hours later, Mac found himself in the middle of what could only be described as the galaxy's most dangerous daycare center. The Vorthak territory was a complex of interconnected tree platforms and ground-level dens that showcased both incredible engineering and a complete disregard for safety regulations. Everywhere he looked, there were drop-offs that would kill a human instantly, and structures that seemed to defy gravity through sheer willpower. And cubs. Lots of cubs, 17 of them to be exact, and 16 were showing symptoms of the same respiratory infection that was slowly killing little Runt. "Pip, please tell me you're getting all this," Mac muttered as he examined his fourth patient of the day, a slightly larger cub who had the energy to try biting his scanner. "Recording everything, Dr. Rodriguez. I'm also monitoring the approximately 30 adult Vorthak who are currently debating whether you're genuinely helping or just playing with their food before eating it." Mac looked up from his work to see a semicircle of massive predators watching his every move. Some looked curious, others looked skeptical, and at least 3 looked like they were mentally measuring him for a coffin. Fantastic. Nothing like a little performance pressure. The breakthrough came when Mac realized the cubs weren't just sick, they were starving. The infection was preventing them from properly digesting the raw meat that formed the basis of their diet. It was a vicious cycle. Too sick to eat, too hungry to fight off the sickness. "I need sugar," Mac announced to the assembled adults. "Simple carbohydrates their systems can process easily." The translation of this request caused considerable discussion among the Vorthok, most of which seemed to involve the phrase, "The pink one has lost his mind." "Dr. Rodriguez," Pip said quietly, "I don't think they understand the concept of processed sugars. Their diet consists entirely of fresh meat." Mac dug through his emergency supplies until he found what he was looking for, a pack of glucose tablets and a handful of energy bars he'd brought for his own survival. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to stabilize the cubs while their immune systems fought off the infection. "Okay, Runt," he said, dissolving a glucose tablet in water and offering it to the smallest cub. "This is either going to help you, or your parents are going to turn me into abstract art. No pressure." Runt lapped at the mixture hesitantly, then more eagerly as his body recognized the easily digestible energy source. Within minutes, his breathing improved noticeably. The effect on the watching adults was immediate. The hostility in their postures shifted to something that might have been cautious optimism. Keth actually took a step closer, his massive frame no longer radiating quite so much potential violence. That's when the Scarans attacked. Mac's first indication that something was wrong was when every adult Vorthak in sight suddenly went dead silent and began moving with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of countless years of evolution as pack hunters. His second indication was the sound of energy weapons charging up somewhere in the jungle canopy. "Pip, please tell me those are friendly neighborhood sounds." I'm afraid not, Dr. Rodriguez. My sensors are detecting multiple heat signatures approaching at high speed. Species identification suggests Scaran raiders. Mac had heard of Scarans, reptilian humanoids with a thriving black market trade in exotic species. If they were here, it was for one reason only: to steal Vorthak cubs for sale to collectors who thought owning apex predators made them look tough. The first energy blast took out a section of tree platform about 10 feet from where Mac was standing with the cubs. The second blast was answered by a roar from Keth that made Mac's bones vibrate, and probably registered on seismic equipment 3 systems away. "Well," Mac said as chaos erupted around him, "this is definitely not covered in my job description." The battle that followed was like nothing Mac had ever experienced. The Vorthak moved like liquid death, flowing through their arboreal environment with impossible grace, while their attackers tried to pin them down with superior firepower. Energy blasts sizzled through the air, while Vorthak warriors leaped impossible distances and struck with claws that could shred reinforced armor. Mac found himself crouched over the cubs, trying to shield them from falling debris while simultaneously treating the sickest ones. It was during this moment of absolute insanity that he realized 3 Scaran raiders had broken through the Vorthak defensive line and were heading straight for the nursery area. "Oh, come on," Mac said, looking around desperately for anything that could pass as a weapon. "This is really not fair." What he found was a broken tree branch about 3 feet long and his own medical scanner, which had a surprisingly solid construction. What he also found, much to his own surprise, was that 18 months of low-gravity combat training and a lifetime of dealing with hostile alien wildlife had given him some skills he hadn't known he possessed. The first Scaran raider made the mistake of assuming the human would cower helpfully while being shot. Instead, Max swung his improvised club with every ounce of strength he possessed and caught the lizard-like alien across the snout with a satisfying crack. "That's for interrupting my medical work, you scaly bastard." The second raider got Mac's scanner embedded in his forehead with enough force to crack the casing. The third one managed to grab Runt before Mac tackled him off a 15-foot platform and into a very unforgiving tree trunk below. The impact knocked the wind out of Mac and probably cracked a rib, but when he looked up to see Runt crawling back toward him with obvious relief, he decided it was worth it. The battle ended abruptly when Zara appeared above the remaining Scaran raiders like some kind of vengeful tree spirit, and demonstrated exactly why evolution had given Vorthak 4 arms with retractable claws. Mac tactfully looked away during the demonstration, but the sounds were definitely going to feature in his nightmares. When the dust settled, Mac found himself sitting against a tree trunk, battered and bleeding from dozens of small cuts, with 17 Vorthak cubs clustered around him like he was their personal protector. The adult Vorthak were staring at him, with expressions he couldn't quite read. "Pip," he said weakly, "please tell me that was the hard part." "I'm afraid not, Dr. Rodriguez. According to my cultural databases, you've just done something unprecedented. You fought to protect Vorthak cubs from outsiders. The adults are currently trying to figure out what that makes you." Keth approached slowly, his massive frame somehow less intimidating than it had been that morning. He said something in the growling Vorthak language that needed no translation. "He's thanking you," Pip said softly, "and he's asking if you'd be willing to stay and help the cubs recover fully." Mac looked down at Runt, who had fallen asleep curled against his leg, breathing easily for the first time since Mac had met him. "Tell him," Mac said, "that I'd be honored." 2 weeks after the Scaran attack, Mac thought he was beginning to understand Vorthak culture. He was wrong, but his confidence was about to be tested in ways that would make fighting armed raiders seem like a relaxing afternoon. It started when Keth approached him during the morning feeding routine. The cubs were all recovering well. Runt had put on weight and was now energetic enough to try climbing Mac like a particularly determined kitten with claws. Mac was dissolving glucose tablets and mixing them with pureed meat when Keth cleared his throat, with a sound like distant thunder. "He wants to speak with you privately," Pip translated, as Keth gestured toward a platform higher up in the canopy. "This appears to be formal." Mac handed Runt to one of the other cubs and followed Keth up a series of rope and wood platforms that creaked ominously under their combined weight. The higher they climbed, the more Mac began to suspect this wasn't going to be a casual chat about cub nutrition. At the top platform, Zara was waiting along with 3 other adult Vorthak Mac hadn't been formally introduced to. Their expressions ranged from curious to deeply skeptical, and all of them bore the ritual scarring that marked senior pack members. "Dr. Rodriguez," Pip whispered, "I believe you're about to witness a formal pack gathering. This is unprecedented for an outsider." Keth began speaking in the ritual cadence Mac had learned indicated important announcements. The other adults listened intently, occasionally interjecting with questions or comments that sounded more like controlled growling than conversation. "He's explaining your actions during the attack," Pip translated. "He's telling them how you protected the cubs despite having no obligation to do so, and how you've continued to care for them as if they were your own offspring." One of the older Vorthak, a female with silver-streaked fur and scars, that suggested she'd survived encounters that would make most beings reconsider their life choices, stepped forward and began what sounded like an interrogation. "She's asking about your family structure," Pip said. "She wants to know if humans form permanent pack bonds, and whether you have cubs of your own." Mac found himself explaining human family dynamics to a group of apex predators who considered child-rearing a community responsibility and measured parental devotion by willingness to die violently for one's offspring. It was exactly as awkward as it sounded. "So you have no mate and no cubs," the silver-streaked female concluded through Pip's translation. "Yet you risked your life for ours. This suggests either great honor or great stupidity." "Could be both," Mac replied honestly. "I'm still figuring that out myself." This apparently amused them, because several of the adults made what Mac had learned were Vortak chuckling sounds, like rocks being tumbled in a cement mixer. Then Keth dropped the bombshell. He spoke directly to Mac in ceremonial tones that needed no translation to convey their importance. The other adults watched Mac's reaction carefully, as if his response would determine something significant. "Dr. Rodriguez," Pitt said quietly, "he's offering you something that has never been offered to an outsider in recorded Vorthak history. He's inviting you to become a permanent pack member with full cub-rearing responsibilities." Mac blinked. "He's what now?" "He's essentially asking if you want to adopt 17 Vorthak cubs and help raise them to adulthood. This would make you a full member of their society with all the rights and responsibilities that entails." Mac looked down at the platform below, where the cubs were playing, or at least doing whatever passed for playing when you were a baby apex predator. Runt was attempting to stalk a piece of rope with all the deadly seriousness of his species, while two of his siblings were engaged in what looked like wrestling, but probably counted as combat training. "What exactly would that involve?" Mac asked. The explanation that followed made Mac's head spin. Becoming a Vorthak pack member meant permanent residence in their territory, participation in all hunting and defense activities, and full responsibility for the cubs' education in everything from tracking prey to identifying edible plants. It also meant undergoing the ritual scarification that marked pack membership and learning to fight with traditional Vorthak weapons. "Oh, and there's one more thing," Pip added helpfully. "Acceptance requires you to prove you can survive the Kraveth, the trial of bonds. It's a ceremonial hunt where you demonstrate your ability to provide for and protect the cubs." "Let me guess," Mac said. "It involves something trying to kill me." "Several somethings, actually. The trial involves tracking and subduing a shadow maw. Think of it as a bear crossed with a tank that's been given anger management issues and then graduated to pure rage." Mac looked at the expectant faces around him. These beings had opened their most sacred institution to him, offered him a place in their family structure that no outsider had ever been granted. The catch was that he had to prove he deserved it, by surviving something that sounded like it had been designed by someone with a very twisted sense of humor. "When would this trial take place?" he asked. More discussion among the adults. "Tomorrow at dawn," Pip translated. "They believe in not giving candidates time to reconsider and flee." Mac thought about his comfortable research lab back on Earth, his predictable schedule, his safe and rational life studying harmless microorganisms. Then he looked down at Runt, who had given up stalking the rope and was now staring up at Mac with those huge, trusting eyes. "Tell them I accept," Mac said. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The adults began what could only be described as a celebration, complete with ritual howling that probably woke up everything within a 5-mile radius. Zara approached Mac and said something that made Pip's translation matrix stutter. She said, "She says she's proud to call you Pack Brother, and she's offering to teach you traditional fighting techniques tonight so you don't embarrass yourself completely tomorrow." "That's reassuring," Mac said dryly. What followed was the most intensive combat training session of Mac's life. Zara was a patient but demanding teacher, showing him how to use Vorthak claw blades, curved weapons designed to extend a fighter's natural slashing ability. The training involved a lot of Mac being knocked down, getting back up, and being knocked down again, while Zara offered what he assumed was constructive criticism, mixed with commentary on his parentage. Dr. Rodriguez, Pip observed after Mac's 15th trip to the ground, I'm detecting significant improvement in your reaction times. You're only falling over every third attack now instead of every second one. Your encouragement is overwhelming, Mac panted, accepting Zora's help to stand up once again. By midnight, Mac had achieved what Zara apparently considered basic competency with the weapons. He had also acquired several new bruises, a better understanding of Vorthak anatomy, and a healthy respect for their training methods. As dawn approached, Mac found himself sitting with the cubs one last time before the trial. They seemed to sense something important was happening. They were quieter than usual, and several of them stayed close to Mac as if offering comfort. Runt climbed into Mac's lap and curled up like he had that first day, except now he was healthy and strong instead of dying from infection. Mac scratched behind the cub's ears and tried not to think about what would happen to these little ones if he didn't survive the next few hours. Pip, he said quietly, if this goes badly, make sure the Research Council knows these cubs need continued medical support. The infection could return if they're stressed or malnourished. Dr. Rodriguez, perhaps we should focus on positive outcomes. After all, the survival rate for the Cravaith is nearly 40%. 40%? Well, 38%. But that's among Vorthak candidates who've been training their entire lives. You're blazing new statistical territory. Mac stood up, careful not to disturb Runt, and checked his weapons one final time. The curved blades felt alien in his hands, but Zara's training had given him at least a chance of using them effectively. You know what, Pip? He said, watching the sun begin to rise through the jungle canopy. I've spent my whole career studying life from a safe distance. Maybe it's time I participated in it, instead. The trial was about to begin, and Mac was as ready as a middle-aged xenobiologist could be to fight a creature that evolution had specifically designed to kill things like him. Which was to say, not very ready at all, but determined to try anyway. The Kravad began at first light, with a ceremony that involved more ritual scarring than Mac was entirely comfortable with. The Vortak elders used traditional bone needles to mark his arms with the preliminary pack symbols. Apparently you earned the full scarification by surviving the trial, not by volunteering for it. Think of it as a down payment, Pip had explained helpfully while Mac tried not to wince. If you die, at least you'll look appropriately decorated for the funeral. The Shadowmaw's territory was a 3-hour trek through jungle terrain that seemed designed to kill visitors through sheer inconvenience. Mac followed Keth and 2 other senior hunters through terrain that involved more vertical climbing than he'd done since college, while trying to remember everything Zara had taught him about Vorthak combat techniques. Remember, Keth had explained through Pip's translation, the trial is not about killing the Shadowmaw. It is about proving you can protect the cubs by subduing a threat without unnecessarily endangering yourself. Reckless bravery is admirable but useless if you die. This struck Mac as excellent advice that he would probably ignore completely once the adrenaline kicked in. They found the Shadowmaw's lair in a clearing where the canopy opened up enough to let in actual sunlight. The creature itself was exactly as advertised, roughly the size of a small shuttle, covered in armor-like scales and equipped with claws that could probably open a sealed bunker without trying. It was currently sunning itself on a flat rock, and looked about as friendly as a tax audit. Okay, Mac said, checking his weapons for the dozenth time. Any last-minute advice? Don't die, Keth replied, which Pip translated with what sounded suspiciously like amusement. Also aim for the soft spots behind the forelimbs. The scales are thinner there. Wonderful. Soft spots. On the creature that's basically a living tank. Mac stepped into the clearing and immediately understood why the trial had such an impressive fatality rate. The Shadowmaw's attention snapped to him with the kind of focus that suggested it was already planning where to start eating. What followed was less of a fight and more of an extended exercise in creative problem-solving while something the size of a small building tried to turn Mac into a paste. The Shadowmaw moved with shocking speed for something so large, and its initial charge forced Mac to dive behind a fallen log that disintegrated under the creature's claws like wet cardboard. "Pip," Mac gasped, rolling frantically to avoid another swipe. "Please tell me you're recording this for posterity." "Every terrifying second, Dr. Rodriguez. I'm particularly impressed by your technique of running away while screaming. It's called tactical repositioning." The breakthrough came when Mac realized he was approaching the problem like a human, instead of like a Vorthak. Humans fought by trying to overpower their opponents. Vorthak fought by using their environment and their opponent's strength against them. The clearing was full of sturdy trees and hanging vines. More importantly, it had several deadfall traps that previous Shadowmaws had created by knocking down trees during their own territorial disputes. Mac began leading the creature in a careful dance around these obstacles, using his superior agility to stay just ahead of its claws while maneuvering it toward the largest pile of fallen timber. "Come on, you oversized luggage," Mac panted, waving his blades to keep the creature's attention. "Follow the nice pink monkey." The Shadow Maw, apparently offended by being called luggage, lunged forward with enough force to crack stone. Mac threw himself sideways at the last possible second, and the creature's momentum carried it straight into the timber pile with a crash that shook the ground. The impact stunned the Shadow Maw long enough for Mac to implement the second part of his plan, which involved using the hanging vines to lash the creature's limbs to the fallen logs. It was exhausting work, made more challenging by the fact that his target kept trying to bite his head off, but Mac's smaller size let him stay out of reach, while the bindings grew tighter. 20 minutes later, Mac stood panting over a thoroughly immobilized Shadow Maw that was glaring at him with the kind of hatred usually reserved for tax collectors and people who talk during movies. "Well," he said to the creature, "this is awkward for both of us." The watching Vorthak emerged from the forest with expressions that Mac was learning to read as impressed surprise. Keth approached the bound Shadow Maw and examined Mac's work with the critical eye of a professional. "He says your technique was unorthodox but effective," Pip translated. "Also, he's never seen anyone subdue a Shadow Maw without drawing blood, either their own or the creature's." "I'm a doctor," Mac said, checking the creature for injuries. "My job is to preserve life, not end it." This apparently struck the Vortek as profoundly meaningful, because they began the ritual howling that marked successful completion of the trial. Mac found himself subjected to another scarification ceremony, this time receiving the full pack markings that designated him as a permanent family member. 6 months later, Mac barely recognized his former self. His research station had been converted into a combination medical clinic and cub nursery, complete with climbing structures that would have given human safety inspectors nervous breakdowns. His daily routine involved dawn hunting practice with Zara, medical checkups for the cubs, afternoon lessons in Vorthok history and culture, and evening combat training that left him exhausted but significantly more dangerous than any xenobiologist had a right to be. The cubs had grown considerably and were now large enough to knock Mac over when they got excited about seeing him, which was often. Runt, in particular, had appointed himself as Mac's personal guardian and refused to let him out of sight during potentially dangerous activities, which, by Vorthak standards, included most forms of daily existence. "Dr. Rodriguez," Pip announced one morning as Mac was teaching 3 cubs the finer points of medical tricorder operation, "we have visitors approaching the territory." Mac looked up from his impromptu lesson to see a familiar shuttle settling into the clearing where he'd first met Keth. The Galactic Research Council logo was prominently displayed on its hull, along with several official-looking communication arrays. "Well," Mac said to Runt, who had immediately gone into protective mode at the sight of strangers, "looks like we're about to have some explaining to do." The shuttle disgorged Director Voss and 2 other council members, all of whom were wearing the kind of protective gear typically reserved for hostile environment research. They approached Mac's station with obvious nervousness, clearly expecting to find either a corpse or a madman. What they found instead was Mac emerging from the jungle, with Runt riding on his shoulders and Zara flanking him like a bodyguard. Mac's appearance had changed considerably. The ritual scarring marked him as Vorthak Pack. His skin was tanned from constant outdoor activity, and his movements carried the fluid confidence of someone who'd learned to survive in an apex predator's world. "Director Voss," Mac said cheerfully, "welcome to the neighborhood. I'd offer you coffee, but we're more of a raw meat and fermented fruit juice operation these days." Voss stared at Mac as if he'd grown an extra head. "Dr. Rodriguez, when you stopped reporting 6 months ago, we assumed you were dead. What exactly has happened here?" Mac gestured to the thriving community around them. Adult Vorthak going about their daily routines while cubs played elaborate games that doubled as combat training, all of it centered around the medical station that had become the heart of their territory. "I got adopted," Mac said simply. "Turns out, when you save someone's kids, they tend to want to keep you around." One of the other council members, a nervous-looking academic Mac didn't recognize, stepped forward with a tablet full of official documents. "Dr. Rodriguez, you've been missing for 6 months, without filing a single report. The council has been forced to list you as missing, presumed deceased. We're here to conduct an official investigation and, if necessary, retrieve your remains." Mac looked at the man with the kind of patient expression he'd learned from watching Zara deal with particularly slow cubs. "Well, as you can see, I'm not dead. I'm also not missing. I'm exactly where I choose to be, doing exactly what I want to do." He scratched Runt behind the ears, causing the cub to purr with a sound like a well-tuned engine. I've learned more about xenobiology in the last 6 months than I did in the previous 10 years of laboratory work. But your research, Voss protested. Your career, you can't just abandon civilization to play house with dangerous predators. Mac's expression hardened slightly and Zara moved closer, not threateningly, but with the kind of protective presence that suggested the conversation could end badly for anyone who upset her pack brother. Dangerous predators, Mac repeated. Director, these dangerous predators have taught me more about family, loyalty, and genuine scientific cooperation than I ever learned from the Council. They've made me part of their pack, trusted me with their most precious resources, and shown me what it means to be part of something larger than myself. He gestured to the cubs, who were now watching the strangers with curiosity tempered by caution. These cubs are going to grow up to be the bridge between our species. They're learning human medicine alongside traditional Vorthak hunting techniques. They speak both languages, understand both cultures, and they're going to make contact between our peoples not just possible, but profitable for everyone involved. And if we order you to return to Earth? Max smiled, and there was something in that expression that spoke of 6 months spent learning to think like an apex predator. Then you'll be ordering someone who's no longer under your authority, he said. I've filed for citizenship with the Vortak Confederacy. Legally speaking, I'm no longer human property. The bureaucratic implications of this statement clearly hadn't occurred to the council members, who began a hurried discussion about jurisdiction and diplomatic protocol. While they argued, Runt climbed down from Mac's shoulders and approached the strangers with a kind of fearless curiosity that marked him as Mac's apprentice. "Hello," Runt said in perfectly accented Standard Galactic, causing all 3 council members to freeze in shock. "I am Runt who learns human ways. Mac Who Hills Cubs is teaching me to be a doctor." The sight of a juvenile Vortheka species, previously considered too dangerous for diplomatic contact, politely introducing himself in flawless galactic standard, was apparently enough to short-circuit whatever objections the council members had been preparing. "Pip," Max said to his AI companion, "please compile a full report on our medical and cultural exchange program. I think the council is going to want documentation." "Already prepared, Dr. Rodriguez. I've also taken the liberty of drafting a formal research proposal for expanded human-Vorthak cooperation. The potential applications for Vorthak biotechnology are quite remarkable." Director Voss looked around at the thriving community, the healthy cubs, and the obvious integration between human and Vorthak society. His bureaucratic mind was clearly calculating the political and economic implications of what Mac had accomplished. "Dr. Rodriguez," he said slowly, "perhaps we should discuss establishing a formal diplomatic and research station here, with you as our official liaison, of course." Mac grinned and ruffled Runt's fur affectionately. "Director, I thought you'd never ask, but you should know, any formal arrangement goes through the Pack Council, and they don't negotiate with anyone who doesn't understand proper cub-rearing protocols." As the sun set over the jungle canopy, Mac watched the council members awkwardly attempting to learn basic Vorthak courtesy from a group of cubs who found their efforts hilariously inadequate. Zara approached and said something that made Pip chuckle. "She says the soft pink bureaucrats need more training before they're ready for real diplomatic work," Pitt translated. "But she thinks they might be educable if they survive the orientation process." Mac settled back against a tree with Runt curled up beside him, watching his 2 worlds begin the slow process of learning to understand each other. It wasn't the career he'd planned, but it was definitely the one he'd been meant for. "You know, Pip," he said, "I think this footnote is going to be a lot more interesting than anyone expected." "Indeed, Dr. Rodriguez. Though technically speaking you're no longer a footnote, you're the opening chapter of an entirely new story." Max smiled as the jungle settled into its evening rhythms around them. Sometimes the best discoveries weren't the ones you went looking for. They were the ones that found you when you were brave enough to let them.